into society. They isolate themselves. And I literally went 27 years without meeting a serious Christian. So, and hence I come to Scripture from a little different perspective than those of you that were raised in Christian homes and had extensive exposure to other Christians. In fact, as I look back on my life, if I'd been in a Christian home, probably I wouldn't be where I am today. It's just having that exposure outside of Christianity. Okay, do we have this set up yet? No, we're still trying to get there. Okay. Let me make that happen. I think I know how to do it.
Yep.
Go to System Preferences. I thought this is all set up already, and there we go, Samsung TV. Let's see if that does it. This is looking good. Hey, it works. Thank you. I thought it was automatic. It's not. I got to set it up. Okay. Well, what I'm going to be talking about this morning is the Genesis flood. I've written 22 books on science faith issues. My 23rd book is going to be on the flood. Although I do have 5 chapters on the flood in this book, Navigating Genesis. And I think you can actually get one of those chapters for free at reasons.org/Ross. But the reason I'm writing a full-length book on Genesis flood, we've done surveys at Reasons to Believe, and the number one reason why people who have not been raised in Christian homes reject the Bible as the Word of God is the flood. The flood is the number one issue for them, just saying, hey, forget this book. I'm not going to address it. And I know many of you have been raised in a young earth creationist setting. What you may not be aware of is that the global flood doctrine is what gave birth to young earth creationism. So the flood came first, the young earth teaching came later, and it actually came out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And you can get the history book of young earth creationism written by Ronald Numbers. He was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and he tells a story of how over the past 150 years, this small denomination that many Christians thought was heretical actually was able to inculcate the whole evangelical community, first with the global flood doctrine and then the young earth creationist doctrine. So we're going to look at Noah's flood, and we're going to address 3 questions. Is the flood of Noah global, local, or worldwide? And right away you might think, what's the difference between global and worldwide? There is a difference. We're going to look at that difference. And this is going to be predominantly a biblical survey of what the Bible's got to say about the flood. First off, and this is the number one reason why non-Christians dismiss the Bible, is that the issue of whether or not the flood is global is not a scientific debate. If it were, scientists, independent of any reading of the Bible, would acknowledge at least some evidence for a recent global flood. And even young earth creationists and global flood proponents acknowledge that when you survey people who are not locked into a particular biblical interpretation, you can't find a single scientist who says that there's any evidence for a recent global flood. This actually came up in the 1987 Supreme Court case where they dealt with creation science. So it's not a scientific debate, but it definitely is a biblical debate. Okay, so what does the Bible say? And this is a principle you're going to get from me all week long here, that when we deal with these issues, you want to look at more than one book of the Bible. The Bible is 66 books, written by 39 different authors. So you want to integrate all the relevant biblical texts. And I've done many debates on the flood of Noah, and when I'm dealing with these doctoral level theologians, typically all they acknowledge is Genesis 6, 7, and 8 when it comes to the flood. But the truth is that there's many biblical texts that deal with the flood. We're going to go through them all. But the first thing I want to do is actually look at what the Bible's got to say about worldwide events. What does the Bible mean when it says something is worldwide? And so these are the particular texts we're going to look at. These are the texts, Old and New Testament, that actually use the term the whole world, or the entire world, or all the world. And so the first one we encounter is in Genesis 41 and 42. And this is the story of Joseph feeding the whole world. And so what do we see in Genesis 41:57? Once again, hey, if you want these slides, I'm more than happy to share them with you. They're all public domain, so I don't care how you use them. And so I'm fine with you taking notes, but just recognize, hey, everything you see in the slides, I'm prepared to give to you. Now, you will need a flash drive. If you give me a flash drive, I'll give you everything. Okay? And if you don't have a flash drive, they sell them at Target for a couple of bucks. So, all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. Now, in the 21st century, you see a phrase, all the world, we think the entire globe. But this is what we see in Genesis 42. The famine had spread throughout the whole of the Egyptian empire and the land of Canaan. That's what they meant by all the world. Because at that time, the Egyptian empire was, quote, a world empire. It extended as far as Lake Victoria in the south of Sudan, and it went as far into Canaan. Okay, the second example we come into is one of Solomon, where it says in 1 Kings, men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world. And of course, you probably remember the story of the queen of Sheba, which is basically Ethiopia, that came to Solomon to hear of his great wisdom. And we see in 1 Kings chapter 10:24, it says, the whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. But if you actually read a little bit farther along, in both 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, it defines from how far away they came. They came from as far away as Sheba, namely Ethiopia, and all the lands of Arabia. His fame had spread to all the surrounding nations. So the whole world that came to hear of Solomon's wisdom came from as far away as Ethiopia and Arabia. Okay, New Testament, book of Acts, says there were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. Acts 2:5. But today we got DNA tests of modern Jews that prove that no first century Jerusalem Jews came from Bolivia or New Zealand. We can actually look at the DNA of Jews alive today and know exactly where they came from. And so it's basically saying the known world at that time. And Paul makes references to this. In Romans 1, the opening verse, he says, your faith, referring to the faith of the Romans, is being reported all over the world. Well, history tells us that didn't extend as far as the Aztecs or the Moors. They didn't hear of the faith of the Romans. And Paul was referring to the Roman world. And we see this again in Colossians 1. All over the world, this gospel is producing fruit and growing, just as it has been doing among you. But Paul's world was the extent of the Roman Empire. So looking at the biblical extent of Noah's flood, we want to integrate all the relevant biblical texts. And we're not just talking Genesis. These are all the texts in the Bible that actually address the flood of Noah. And notice, what's happening here? Here we go. Oh, it's just so slow. I'm sorry. We have Genesis 1 to 3, Genesis 6 to 9, Book of Job, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Jeremiah, Romans, 2 Peter, Revelation. These are all texts that are actually relevant to the flood of Noah. And so the question is the flood of Noah worldwide, which would be the known world of Noah, or is it truly global in extent? Okay. I'm hoping that before the island, you get to do the Napali Trail. This is a photo I took about halfway along the Napali Trail. It's on the northwest end of the island. It's a trail that's actually cut right into the cliff. You look down this way, you look up. Anyway, it's a fantastic trail. Takes you through deserts and jungles, and you end up at Kalalau Beach. Okay. Job 38. Who shut up the sea behind doors? when it bursts forth from the womb, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place. Job 37, 38, and 39, as I explained last night, basically takes you through the content of the creation events in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, 1 chapter, Book of Job, 3 chapters. If you want the scientific details, you get way more in the Book of Job than you do in the Book of Genesis. So Job is actually the most extensive of the creation texts. But here it's addressing the events of creation day 3, when God transformed the earth from a water world where you only have water on the surface of the earth to where now we have oceans and continents coexisting. But it's basically making a point here that once the continents are in place, they have these act as fixed limits for the waters. And it actually gets more explicit when you look at Psalm 104. And Psalm 104 is the longest of the creation psalms in the Bible. There are many creation psalms, but Psalm 104 is the most extensive. And just like with Job 37, 38, and 39, it covers all the content that we see in Genesis 1, but not in a chronological sequence. But it's clear when it's addressing creation day 1, 2, 3, or 4, just by looking at the context. So when you look at verses 6 through 8, it's clear it's a reference to the beginning of creation day 3, where it says, "You," referring to God, "covered it," namely the earth, "with the deep," referring to the waters. The waters stood above the mountains, so the water covered the whole surface of the earth. But at your rebuke, the waters fled. They went down into the valleys to the place you assigned for them. In other words, the text here is giving God the credit for causing trenches to form in the oceans. And so in the beginning, the ocean depth was fairly even, but in creation day 3, we now see deep trenches where all the water can collect, and then continental land masses that pop out elsewhere. That's verses 6, 7, and 8. But what you get in verse 9 is this explicit statement. You set a boundary they, the waters, cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. So here we see an explicit statement with reference to creation day 3 that once the continents are in place, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. So this explicitly rules out the possibility that the flood of Noah could be global in extent. And this isn't the only text. You actually see this in 3 other creation psalms, and you see it in the book of Job. You also see it in Proverbs 8. Proverbs 8 is another creation text that takes you through the content of the 6 creation days, but not in a chronological order. It says here in verse 29 that God gave the sea its boundary so the waters would not overstep his command. And we go into the New Testament, and what we see in 2 Peter chapter 2 and chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 6, it says, "By water also the world of that time," this is a reference to Noah's flood, "the world of that time was deluged and destroyed." And I mentioned last night that in biblical Hebrew, there is no word for universe. There is in the Greek New Testament. It's the word cosmos. And so the word world there is the word cosmos. Matter of fact, let me give you the explicit Greek here. The relevant Greek phrase is tote cosmos. But what I want you to notice is in the Greek New Testament, it uses an adjective to qualify the word cosmos. And the amplified definition is the world at the time the event took place. So basically we've got Peter here saying the world at the time of Noah is not the same as the world at the time of Rome. And here again it's referring to the world of humanity. And this is made explicitly clear in 2 Peter 2:5, where it says, God brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. It doesn't say he brought a flood upon the world. Again, it's qualified. We're talking about the world of ungodly people. And in 2 Peter 3:7, it emphasizes it's the world of the ungodly people, and the flood is for the purpose of destroying ungodly people, for the destruction of ungodly men. So it's basically making the point. The flood of Noah extended as far as ungodly people lived. And if you go back to the Genesis account, It's not just the world of ungodly people, it's the world of the nephesh or soulish animals that are associated with ungodly people. So when you're looking at Genesis 6, 7, and 8, you have to be careful to see what Hebrew words are used for the animals. It uses 8 different words for the animals, but in every case it's limited to the nephesh animals, the animals that have been endowed by God with a capacity to form emotional relationships with human beings, to be tamed by human beings, and to serve and please them. Now that includes all birds and mammals. As it says in the book of Job, we humans have been able to tame every single bird and mammal species. We've even been able to tame a handful of the higher reptilian species. Only a handful are capable of forming an emotional bond with us. I've been to Florida where I met a man who had a pet alligator. But he says it's extraordinarily difficult to make a pet of an alligator. You basically take the alligator from the time it comes out of the egg, and you have to spend at least an hour per day handling that alligator. If you do that, by the time it becomes 20 feet long, it will be a pet for you. And you can actually train it to do things for you. But he's told me this: I dare not miss a day. If I miss even one day, that alligator will turn against me. And as it says in the book of Job, when it refers to Leviathan, which I think is a reference to the crocodile or the alligator, it's the most difficult of the nephesh animals to tame. I'm going to be speaking about this tonight, but I'll give you a little preview. What you see at the end of the book of Job, God says, you've been able to tame all these nephesh animals, but notice it takes a higher being to tame these animals. Likewise, only I can bring humility to a proud human heart. Just like it takes a higher being to tame these birds and mammals, likewise it takes a higher being for us human beings to be tamed from our pride and be humbled before him. Okay, now I've debated many theologians who hold to a global flood interpretation of Genesis. And in every one of those debates, they turn to Genesis 7:19. They look at this as the strongest exegetical case for why the flood has been global. And when you read it in most English translations, you can see why they think this text proves beyond any shadow of doubt that the flood had to be global. The text says the waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains. Now the word for mountains can also be that word for hills. There's no distinction in Hebrew for the word har. It could be hills or mountains, but it says the waters rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains or hills under the entire heavens were covered, and it says they were covered by at least 15 cubits, which is like 22 feet. And so they say, it's basically saying all the land masses on the face of the earth were covered by that depth. That's Genesis 7, but again, you want to read everything that the text has got to say. We go to Genesis chapter 8, and this is where the waters are receding. And what we see in Genesis 8:5, we got Noah on top of the ark, and now as the waters are receding, he can see the tip tops of the mountains or the hills. They become visible to him. That's Genesis 8:5. And so time progresses, and here we got him on top of the ark here. But what does he do in Genesis 8:9? He releases a dove. And so here's the dove being released, and this dove flies over the waters. And what does the text say? The dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water over all the surface of the earth. What's interesting here is it's using the same Hebrew phrase in the context of the dove that it does back in Genesis 7:19. So Noah could see the distant hills, the dove could not. I said I wasn't going to give you any homework. This is just something fun you can do, okay? Which is to actually calculate the effect of the crow's nest effect. So if Noah is 20 feet higher above the surface of the water than the dove, how much more distance can he see? And you'll be amazed how many more miles away he can see than the dove can see with just a 20-foot elevation advantage. And so that's the whole point here. Because he was at a higher level above the waters, he could see 20 or 30 miles more distantly than the dove that was flying low over the waters. So in the context of the dove, there's water over the whole face of the earth, whereas Noah earlier, when the waters were actually less receded, could see the distant hills. Which implies in Genesis 7:19, what it's saying is, with the flood now in full force, Noah's on top of the ark. Everywhere he looks from one horizon to the other, all he sees is water. Water from one horizon to the other. Which tells us that the flood of Noah, at the minimum, had to have an extent of about 300 miles across. Because on top of the ark, he might be able to see distant hills and mountains that are 150 miles away. So we're not talking a tiny flood. I've also been debating theistic evolutionists at different seminaries who try to claim, yeah, there was a flood, but we're talking a tiny flood. Well, this reference here tells us in Genesis 7:19, at a minimum, the flood had to have an extent of at least 300 miles in diameter. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make sense of this passage where Noah sees only water from one horizon to the other. Now, probably a more significant theological point would be what the Bible says about the outpouring of God's wrath. In fact, over breakfast, I was talking with some of you about how Noah's flood was actually an act of mercy. Humanity was in danger of self-extermination. You'll see in Navigating Genesis, I calculate what was happening to people. If there was no expression of murder before the flood, the human population would have risen to 17 billion individuals before Noah was even, or before Adam was even finished with his life. By the time he's 760, very conservatively, there would be 17 billion people on the face of the earth. Clearly, that didn't happen. So what kept the population low? What kept the population low was the sin of Cain. And if you read Genesis chapter 4, you see that one of Cain's descendants bragged that he had murdered 7 people. And what you see in Genesis chapter 6, it uses 2 Hebrew nouns to describe the evil of the people in the days of Noah. These are 2 words nowhere else in the entire Old Testament. And basically, these words are saying these individuals, all they could think about all the time is how they could do physical harm to their fellow man. They were incapable of thinking anything good at all. They were incapable of repenting, incapable of forgiving. All they could think about, how can I do physical harm to my fellow man? And so we calculate in Navigating Genesis that in the hundreds of years before the flood, the murder rate had to be a minimum of 95%. In other words, at least 95% of people being born had their lives being terminated by being murdered by their fellow man. In fact, I would argue that the average lifespan today is actually longer than the average lifespan in the days just before Noah. Yes, people had the capacity to live to be 900, but the fact is the vast majority of people were having their lives terminated probably before they were 40 years of age. And so today, we're actually the population, the generation that has the longest average lifespan. But what I want to do is take you through the Bible and what it's got to say about the outpouring of God's wrath and where he expresses his wrath and where he doesn't. And so what we see in Genesis 7:22, all that was in dry land, all the breath and the spirit of life. Okay, this takes me back to a weekend-long debate I had with 3 global flood theologians. And each of them was giving 2 one-hour lectures throughout that weekend. And their main point was, when you go through Genesis 6, 7, and 8, you see these words, every and all. And moreover, it consistently uses the word arrest for the earth. And they basically made the point, there are words in biblical Hebrew that refer to the earth that could never the entire earth. The word arrest that you see in Genesis 1, it's got 5 distinct literal definitions, one of which is the entire surface of the earth. But it also could be a reference to your backyard or your nation. But they said there is one word, karabah, that could never be used to refer to the entirety of Earth's surface. And all three of them said explicitly, this word never appears in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. So I did some follow-up on that and discovered that they were wrong. It does show up in Genesis 7:22. All the dry land, Karaba, all with the breath of the Spirit of life. So the whole point is, when you hear claims like that, check it out. Go to your Bible, be a Berean, actually check it out. Now, all global flood hypotheses require radical changes in the laws of physics. In fact, I got another debate set up with a global flood theologian. But the last time I debated him, we talked for 2 hours after the debate. And he says, Hugh, I want to tell you, we who believe in a global flood have a major problem. That is, in order to make the flood global, we have to accelerate the radiometric decay rates. Because basically they're saying that the mountains got leveled down, then they got pushed up. That's a lot of plate tectonics you've got to squeeze into a 5-month period. How they do it, they accelerate the radiometric decay rates. And you heard me say in the last couple of lectures, hey, the Bible tells us explicitly there's no change in those laws. And he says, well, here's a bigger problem for us. If you accelerate the radiometric decay rates in order to level all the mountains so the water can cover the whole face of the earth, and then have those mountains pop up after the flood, that means we have to accelerate the radiometric decay rates by a factor of 1 billion times during that 5-month period. And he said, here's the problem that he admitted. He says, within the bodies of every animal life form, in fact, every plant life form, is potassium. And potassium comes in several isotopes, but a big chunk of the potassium in your body is potassium-40. Potassium-40 is radiometric. Now, it's got a decay half-life of 39 billion years. So with a decay half-life that long, I wouldn't worry about the potassium decaying and incinerating your body. But if you accelerate that by a factor of 1 billion times, what that means is every plant and animal on the face of the earth would immediately vaporize from the heat of the radiometric decay. And it's not just potassium. As you're eating breakfast today, you're consuming thorium and uranium. And those actually have shorter half-lives, 14 billion, 4.5 billion years. But there's enough uranium in your bodies that if you did accelerate the radiometric decay rates by a factor of 1 billion times, again, you would instantly vaporize. Matter of fact, all the water would immediately evaporate. And as I was explaining to this person I was debating, I said, you know, you've even got a problem with these radiometric decays being reflected off the moon. And so, because you say, well, maybe the water would ameliorate the radioactivity. And it says, no, it all gets evaporated, and hey, every time the moon comes up, it's going to reflect all that radiation back to the earth. But I basically shared with him, all this from a biblical perspective is immaterial, because the Bible in 7 places explicitly states no change in the laws of physics. But here's the problem, and this was admitted by the fellow I was debating. He basically said, well, if there's no change in the laws of physics, there's no way the flood can be global in extent. We have to have the radiometric decay rates accelerated in order to get the plate tectonic activity we need to be accelerated by that degree. And incidentally, you've got another problem. If you're going to make the plate tectonic activity aggressive enough to level the mountains and pop them back up again, now you're going to have tsunamis. And what it tells us is that the people on board the ark and the animals were able to survive the 13-month period of the flood. If you've got a lot of tectonic plate activity going on, that's not going to be possible. Now, how many of you have ever lived through a significant earthquake? Okay? You have. You have. I have. I was sharing again with people at breakfast that we happened to be experiencing an earthquake where we're right above the epicenter. And the earthquake shook our home to such a degree that we had a chest of drawers in our bedroom. It got slammed against the opposite wall and shattered. And so we had to replace that chest of drawers. But because of the building codes in California, we looked at the walls, we couldn't see a scratch or a dent. The home was perfectly secure, our furniture was destroyed. That was a magnitude 6.1 earthquake. We're talking enough tectonics to level the mountains and rebuild them up again. We're now looking at magnitude 11 earthquakes. When you go up every magnitude, it's a factor of 10. A magnitude 9 earthquake is so severe, it shakes the bark off all the trees. And so 100 times that is what you're going to be experiencing when you're sitting there in the ark. But no worries. These biblical texts explicitly tell us the laws have not changed. But if the laws have not changed, there is no possibility for a global flood. Now, what about the date for the flood? Well, we have a good historical date for Abraham. He lived roughly 4,000 years ago. So, and it's not just the genealogies in the Bible that help us establish that date. There's extra biblical historical accounts that put Abraham at about 4,000 years ago, plus or minus 50 or 60 years. Then it tells us in Genesis 10, the world was divided in the days of Peleg. And I believe that's a reference to breaking of the land bridge that joined Asia to North America. During the last ice age, sea levels were 390 feet lower than they are today. And we're talking just 14,000 years ago, where the sea levels were that low. That meant that there was a land bridge joining France and England. There was a land bridge joining Asia and North America. In fact, that land bridge was 500 miles wide. But when the sea levels rose with the end of the last ice age, the Bering Strait formed. And the waters in the Bering Strait are so treacherous that if you don't have a modern vessel, you're not going to be able to cross from Asia to North America or go from North America back to Asia. And I believe that's what the text is referring to in Genesis 10:25. The world was divided in the days of Peleg. And here's the context. You got Genesis chapter 11, where the people say, we're going to build a city and a tower so we will not be scattered over the face of the earth. What did God tell Noah in chapter 9? Multiply and fill the earth. It's the same command he gave to Adam. Adam's descendants refused to obey the command to multiply and fill the earth. And so we got God saying to Noah, multiply and fill the earth. We look at the text, it's repeated twice. When God repeats himself twice, he's basically saying, this is really serious. And here's what God is worried about. He knows that we humans are sinners. If we stay in one place with one nation, one major capital city, one government, what's going to happen? That government, since it has a complete monopoly on the citizenry, will oppress its citizens. Look at world history. Wherever there's been a nation that's had complete control over its citizens, at every single time they've oppressed the citizens. And where the oppression leaves off, the citizens leave and go to a different nation. The United States is a beneficiary of persecution going on in other nations. People leave. And so God's plan in Genesis chapter 11 was for multiple nations to be competing with one another for citizens. So that if one nation oppresses its citizens, they have the option of leaving that nation and going to another nation. And so God is basically saying, look, you're not listening to my command. And so he destroyed the tower, he destroyed the city, and scattered people over the face of the earth. Now, we have mitochondrial DNA evidence that actually gives us, to high precision, a date for when the great migrations happened. And they basically took place along the south shore of Asia and the west shore of North and South America. Matter of fact, you were able to get from the Bering Strait down to the south tip of South America. That migration happened in less than 1,000 years. I grew up on the west coast of British Columbia. I remember when I was a young boy, my dad would take me out there and say, I'm going to show you how easy it is to survive in coastal British Columbia. It was pouring rain, and he said, okay, we're going to build a lean-to. The lean-to was for the fire, because it was pouring rain. He says, now go get the driftwood. In the middle of the driftwood, you're going to find dry wood that's very easy to get a fire started. You build that under the lean-to, get the fire going. The fire destroys the lean-to, but now you got a fire going. Now you build a big lean-to, that's for you. And he says, now go out into the waters there. You're going to see clams and oysters. Easy food to gather. And then he said, look along the bushes here. There's berries, there's wild onions, there's wild lilies. There's your vegetables. And basically taught us just how easy it was to survive in that environment. And he says, notice you got a beach all the way here. It's really easy to walk. So that's a lesson I learned, just how easy it would be for humans in that time to get from Alaska down to the south tip of Argentina in literally just a few hundred years. So that date comes in at about 45,000 years ago. And if you look at the date for the dividing of the world in the days of Peleg, which is 11,000 years ago, and Abraham, which is 4,000 years ago, that allows you to calibrate the genealogy, and guess what? You come up with approximately the same date, 40,000 years ago, give or take 30,000 years. Now, what about the flood? This is what Arabia looks like today. But if you go back during the last ice age, 15 to 75,000 years ago, this is what it looked like. The Red Sea was essentially dry ground. The Persian Gulf was 95% dry ground because the sea levels were 390 feet lower than they are today. And here are the place names. In Genesis 2, it tells us that the Tigris and Euphrates flow to the land of Asher, that the Pishon flows out of the mountains of Havilah, and that the Gihon flows out of the mountains of Cush, and these four rivers come together in the Garden of Eden. Where do they come together? They come together in this particular location there. That location today is 200 feet below sea level, but in the time of the last glacial, it was actually above dry ground. And the text also tells us in Genesis 4 that the land of Nod is to the east of Eden. So Eden is in the east, but Nod is even further east, basically the south tip of Persia. And then there's four sources of the water. You've got torrential rain coming down for 40 days and 40 nights. It tells us the water came up from the underground aquifers. Water came up from below. Underneath today's Persian Gulf is a huge aquifer. There's also an aquifer under Mesopotamia, but that aquifer is only about 10% the size of the one under the Persian Gulf. So you've got this huge amount of water coming up. The one geological evidence, this is the only geological evidence we have for Noah's flood, is they found a berm at the Gulf, or at the mouth of Hormuz. And that would be this location right here. They found a berm there, evidence that it was broken. The breaking of that berm would allow a mad rush of water from the Indian Ocean to come in to the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia. And so this would be the approximate extent of Noah's flood. Now the point here is, compared to your traditional old earth creationist models for Noah's flood, this is about 5 times bigger than what you see in the literature on Noah's flood. As far as I know, this is the first time this has ever been published. I don't see it anywhere else. And then the waters recede, and as we come out of the ice age, we wind up with this story of Noah's flood here. Here's where Eden would be, and a Nod. And my whole point here is, I think we can resolve this debate between old earth creationists and young earth creationists, basically making the point, what we can do from an old earth perspective, we can make the flood a whole lot bigger. And from a young earth creationist perspective, they can make the flood a whole lot smaller. In both cases, you have a worldwide flood that wipes out the entire population of ungodly people and all the animals, the soulish animals that are associated with them. You don't have a problem with the ark having to house millions of different species of life. The text told Noah, take on board 7 pairs of the animals that are most crucial for your agricultural industry, and take 1 pair of all the rest of the basar animals. That's the Hebrew word. It says 1 pair of all the basar. What does that word mean? It means soulish animals that have a relationship with human beings, which means there were no kangaroos on board the ark. They had no contact with human beings. There were no emperor penguins on board the ark. They had no contact with human beings. No polar bears. They had no contact with human beings. So this removes the objection we get from atheists to say, The ark, no matter how big you try to make it, is going to be way too small. 8 people can't take care of all these animals. You've got an absurdity here in the text. What they're overlooking is that the biblical text actually tells us we're not talking tens of thousands of species of life. We're probably talking maybe 1,000 pairs of animals maximum, in which case 8 people can take care of them. And keep in mind, Noah took 100 years to build the ark. I'm sure he designed special sluice boxes in the ark that make it efficient to take away the waste products of these animals. And notice he was also told, take on board water and food for all these animals. So he wasn't just housing the animals, he was housing food and water to sustain them for 13 months. And so what I was able to share in that weekend debate with these 3 theologians who held the global flood idea, I said, we who take an old earth perspective, we got nothing to lose by adopting a larger flood model. And young earth creationists have nothing to lose from adopting a smaller flood model. In both cases, you wind up with a worldwide flood that both of us, all of us, can endorse. A global flood does nothing to make the young earth model more tenable, either biblically or scientifically. And so I think this is one way that young earth creationists and old earth creationists can shake hands, give each other a hug for the Lord, and basically wind up by saying, yeah, the text teaches a worldwide flood. You can read more about this in the book Navigating Genesis, and willing to wait a couple of years, I'll have a full-length book on this, but I'll take questions. And like always, I'll take questions in any subject. It doesn't have to be what you're hearing today. Yes?
So I know you're an astrophysicist, and you definitely have probably the most in-depth knowledge about the stars and stuff, but does you think the fossil record does it show any evidence of like rapid fossilization of those animals, like all being wiped out at the same time around in that area, in that land? Because I imagine if all of that water came rushing in so quickly, it would smack those animals, it would kill all those animals, and they'd all be set on around the same area, very, very close.
Yeah, well, to get animals fossilized, you need the flood to be bigger and a lot longer lasting. I'll give you an example. There was a major flood in the Mississippi Valley about 30 years ago. How big was it? It was 50 feet above the river. And it covered tens of thousands of square miles over many different states. And it lasted for 4 months. That was 30 years ago. We go there today, no fossils. We see no evidence that the flood actually happened. So to get remaining geological evidence and fossils, the flood has to last a whole lot longer than a few months. The flood of Noah, it was 13 months from start to end. So it's just too short of a time, and the flood, again, wasn't extensive enough. It wasn't violent enough for all that to happen. Now, as far as the receding of the waters go, people say, well, if we're talking a flood that only covered 1 million square miles, how does the flood remain? After all, it takes 7 months for it to completely recede. Well, there's a 4th source of water I failed to mention. This was an ice age event, so the mountains around that region would have been loaded with snow and ice. The snow and ice, except for the mountains of Ararat, is all gone. So I believe that consistent with the torrential rains, water coming in from the Indian Ocean, water coming up from underneath the Persian Gulf oasis, you also had a huge quantity of snow and ice being melted off the mountains. And that's what happened in the Mississippi Valley. The reason why that flood lasted 4 months, all the water flowing into the Gulf of Mexico was being replaced by snow and ice being melted off the Rockies and other mountain ranges that fed the Mississippi River. And so, yeah, it's not like the Cambrian explosion where you get a bunch of fossils. You're not going to get any fossil evidence at all, and we don't see any, which again is evidence that we're talking a relatively limited flood event. Yes?
What is the need to use science to prove the Bible?
Pardon me?
What is the need to use science to prove the Bible? Because when you were talking about the dimensions yesterday, I thought, why would we use like one-dimensional knowledge to prove a multi-dimensional God?
Yeah, well, What's unique to Christianity is that it's two books of revelation. You've got the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And both of them are multiple books. The book of Scripture is 66 books written by 39 authors. The book of nature is dozens of different scientific disciplines. And God says, look at nature, and it corroborates what's in the Bible. Look at the Bible, it corroborates what's in the book of nature. They overlap. They overlap to a sufficient degree that they corroborate one another. And it's kind of like what you see in a court of law, where you've got two independent witnesses corroborating one another. Now you've got a strong case.
So I have a follow-up question. So if the book of nature or science disproves something in the Bible, would you still believe in the Christian faith?
Okay. That would be like saying, okay, what if you find something in the book of Hebrews that contradicts the book of Romans? Which book are you going to throw out? No, both books are from the inspired mind of God, for whom it's impossible to lie or deceive. So if I see something in Hebrews that appears to contradict something in Romans, I know I've misinterpreted the text. I look for the interpretation error. The book of nature is from the God for whom it's impossible to lie or deceive. The book of Scripture is from the same God for whom it's impossible to lie or deceive. If I see an apparent contradiction between the two, I know I've made a mistake in interpretation in one or both books. And that's how science and theology operates. In science, we constantly run into anomalies, things that don't fit. And so what do? We study the anomaly to try to resolve that, and basically that's how we make progress. And this is how science works. Every time we resolve an anomaly or a problem or an apparent contradiction, it reveals more problems that we weren't even aware of. But the fact that those new problems are at a lower level of significance than the one we resolved tells us we're on the pathway towards truth. Will we ever get the complete truth? No, we won't. But we'll get closer and closer and closer. And theology works the same way. I mean, if you go to research seminaries, they're debating all the time between different books of the Bible and how to reconcile them. They too run into these anomalies. But every time they resolve an anomaly, they wind up discovering more anomalies, but those new anomalies at a lower level of significance, which gives them greater confidence that the Scriptures indeed are the inspired, inerrant Word of God. So the same principles work on both sides. As I said last night, the scientific method works for both books. And incidentally, 9 years after I became a Christian, I finally discovered where the scientific method came from. It comes from the pages of Scripture and Reformed theology. So now I refer to the scientific method as the biblical testing method. Okay, we're out of time because Rick is going to be up in 12 minutes. I'll take questions at lunchtime, breaks, whatever. We got a 12-minute break now. Only 12 minutes, sorry, Rick.
Okay, Tony's up.
He's up, okay. All right, okay, break time. And you can ask me questions during the break.